Clever classrooms then, this is what we decided to call it. It's about classrooms and how they impact on learning. And basically what we're saying is that classrooms can be an active factor in how teachers go about their education, how they actually deliver their education. They're not a passive thing. They're something that can actively be used to improve the educational experience for their pupils. The background is that this is, in a sense, a subset of internal environment quality research, which is a big tradition, a big discipline where people look at heat, light, sound, air quality, do a lot of laboratory experiments. It's stuff you can measure. And it's got to an interesting point as a discipline. These are quotations from a recent special issue. And what does it say? The feeling of comfort is a composite state involving an occupant's sensation of all of the factors. In other words, what they're saying is, we've done a lot of laboratory work, but actually what the person really experiences is multidimensional. In other words, we're actually absorbing this space through all our senses in all its dimensions. We're not just looking at one aspect, which is what in research terms has often happened in this discipline, just to try and pin things down. We know that school buildings make a difference. We know that buildings affect us. We know that when we go to a theatre, it's an exciting experience, and when we go to sleep, it's usually in a calm experience, and when we're trying to study, we need a sort of concentrated, we go for different sorts of experiences in different spaces. We walk into a cathedral and it's often uplifting. The Education Endowment Foundation in the UK has said physical environment, very low or no impact on learning. No objective evidence for these impacts. Basically a bit on air quality, a feeling that you need to get things to a minimum level of a decent standard of I don't suppose repair, I suppose would be the word, but nothing beyond that. So very clear statement in a very well respected source that there's no impact or no evidence of impact of spaces on buildings. So you get this disjuncture between the fact that we all know it, but actually very difficult to find the evidence for it. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is that we're not looking at all the factors. So partial studies of one or other of the factors rather than all of them, and maybe not all of them actually, just some of them. And then complex interactions between the factors. So again, part of the background for our study was to say, what are the factors that we should consider if we take a broad view? And the second thing was, how do we analyse the complexity of that and the interactions between those different things? So this was the start of the HEAD project, Holistic Evidence and Design. There's the aim, to explore if there's any impact of school building design on the learning rates of children. Another part of the background, incidentally, was that we'd made lots of recommendations to clients about what was good about schools, and they ignored them all because there wasn't evidence about the impact to learning. So we know that learning and assessment in formal tests isn't the only thing about education, but we also know that if we don't link our results to those, they tend to get ignored. So we've decided to do a project that orients particularly on that aspect of education. We looked at primary schools. This is schools for 5 to 11-year-olds in the UK, young children, and this was a deliberate choice because in primary schools the children spend pretty much all the time in one classroom for a whole year. So if the space is going to make a difference to them and impact on them, it's most likely to be evident for those children. So they're an ideal thing academically to study in relation to, is there an impact on the school design on their learning rates? Oh, and the other thing is there's lots of measures of their performance. There's lots of measures of how they've progressed academically through that year. We selected different schools, different ages. You can see the examples of the pictures here, all different eras they come from. And they were different sizes and they had different records of academic achievement as schools. And in addition to that, when we went to the schools, we chose different classrooms, different year groupings, different orientations, as much difference as we could get into the sample as we can, because we're trying to explain variation, what causes variation, so we need that variation in the sample. So what are the headline results? Headline results are, interestingly, that if you put in the design parameters, that's the light, sound, air, temperature, air quality, etc. That's this column here. And if you say, what's their impact on learning individually, they all come up as being statistically relevant, statistically actually quite strong influencers of learning. Interestingly, if you then put them in the multi-level modelling, where you factor in the pupil factors, where you factor in the way they compete with each other, 3 of them drop out and you're left with 7 factors that actually seem to really be strong factors in play in the real world when we experience everything together, which is what we do. So these are the 7 factors we've identified: light, temperature, air quality, ownership, flexibility, complexity and colour. In terms of the scale of the impact, we modelled all of those factors by statistically fixing it as though there was an average pupil, an average teacher, an average everything except the physical spaces, and then we modelled the impact on learning of those physical spaces from the least effective to the most effective, and we scaled that on the variation in learning across the pupils as a whole. The physical spaces on their own explain 16% of the variation in learning of the pupils. This is a big effect. This was using the national curriculum sub-levels, which is the standard way of assessing pupils in the UK, on reading, writing and maths, averaged across those 3. Those pupils have to learn all of those things in the same space anyway, so we put them together as a composite measure. It doesn't make sense to separate them out. So 16% is big. And the other factors have been removed from the calculation, if you like, by fixing them in the calculation, by fixing them in the equation. So we're pretty sure about this. We think this is the case. It's based on 3,766 pupils, 153 classrooms. It's a big sample now, and it's levelled out as an effect that we're really certain about. How's it split up? Well, interestingly, half of it is down to the naturalness factors, and about a quarter each for the individualisation and the stimulation factors. So that sort of makes sense, doesn't it? That just actually having somewhere that's comfortable and that you can exist in a reasonable way is very important. But so are those other things. They account for as much together as those traditional factors that are taken into account. Weirdly, the school level didn't come out, and by that I mean the shared facilities, let's say the hall, the PE facilities, the playgrounds, the size of the school, things like that, the routes through the school in terms of whether it was intelligible or not. All of those things at the school level did not appear in the calculation, and that was very surprising. We did actually analyse at 3 levels, but we dropped it because it wasn't actually adding anything to the analysis. But just to give you an example of the impact that we're talking about, this is the least effective classroom on the left there, and its modelled impact on learning. This is the most effective classroom, the green one, and its modelled effect on learning. The gap between them, if you theoretically moved this standard child, I know they don't exist, but if you did, from the least effective to the most effective classroom, would be 1.3 sub-levels in over a year. 1.3 sub-levels should be compared with 2 sub-levels, which is the progress you expect a child to make in a year. So in other words, this is a huge impact, although it's an extreme. It's from the worst to the best classroom. Why didn't the school have an effect as a whole at the school level? This is the variance in learning at the school level on the top graph. My statistician says what you have to look at is the 0 and the dashed line. And the, in inverted commas, worst school overlaps in its normal distribution with the best school. In other words, there isn't that much difference between the worst and the best. There isn't enough difference to be able to actually strip out and understand what the effect is. And I'll come back to why that is. This is doing the same thing by classrooms, and you can see the worst classroom at the bottom there is a lot lower than the best one there. So there's a lot more that is capable of being explained at the classroom level. And our estimate is that there's only actually 3% of the variation available at the school level to be explained. What does that look like in practical terms? So these are the predicted impacts of learning in 10 schools. So this is in one local authority. And the vertical things are the modelled effectiveness of the classrooms. So just imagine what that means. That means that in this school here, you've pretty much got the worst classroom and you've pretty much got the best classroom in the sample. The variation of the classrooms within a given school is huge. And so there's a really strong message here, which is that you actually have to, it's not a matter of good and bad schools, it's a matter of more effective and less effective classrooms, and you have to assess each classroom, even within the same school, to know whether it's working. And this has implications for designing, because it means actually you should be doing this inside-out design, really. You should be getting the individual spaces right and then putting them together into a school. And if you're a head teacher and you're assessing classrooms, it means you can't just make general statements. You need to look at each one with the teacher and say, how's it working? How can it be improved? So that was quite surprising. We were very surprised by that, but it's a clear story, isn't it? I'm going to give you an example of why that might be. In the UK, this is a standard, we've gone to standard baseline designs in the UK. So this is a standard one, double loaded corridors, corridor down the middle, classrooms either side. So one's north facing, one's south facing. One works, one doesn't work. We came across it quite a lot of times. Some were absolutely cooking in the summer and there's a lot of glare, all these sorts of things. Walk across the corridor, it's all working fine. And so it's simple, really. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not complicated. Some of this stuff is quite simple. And of course, you then layer on top of that the effect of what the teachers do to the classroom in terms of how they dress it or how it's decorated in different colours. And you can get a lot of variety within a single school. So the fact the school level didn't come out actually isn't so surprising after all. So 7 areas. First one is naturalness. We started off saying that the more natural light, the better. We ended up saying a good level of natural lighting is good, but this could be small windows south-facing or big windows north-facing, and the issue of glare has to be dealt with. And glare was seen as a real problem, and so that had to do with blinds and those sorts of things. We also assumed, and this is, if you like, confirmed by the analysis, that you do need good quality artificial lighting, because if you model it, there's going to be some time of day, some time of year where you need it, or some part of the classroom that's too far from the window and you need a good quality of artificial lighting. So those are the things we took into account, and you can see that sometimes, even if you give people good windows, they can block them up with furniture. So sometimes the behavioural things got in the way, but generally speaking, it does confirm that light is important. This is the biggest factor that we have of our 7, but not just more is better. It's a matter of enough and without the glare. Naturalness then, air quality. So large openings, we just measured we measured practical things. We did these spot measurements of air quality, and very often the meter, which has an alarm that goes off at I don't know why it's got an alarm, it's not dangerous, but it goes off at 2,000 parts per million, quite often of CO2. Quite often the alarm would go off, so we came across lots of classrooms with really poor air quality. But we didn't rely on those readings. We put it down to practical things like, are there openable windows? Are they big enough? Are they reachable? Are they at different levels? Just quite simple factual things. And if they are, that's good. There was a special case where we went back and couldn't understand some classrooms that weren't working, and they were classes that actually had high-level windows and roller blinds. Once the roller blind was down, they couldn't operate the windows. So that was just a very specific instance that affected 5 classrooms that didn't seem to fit in at all, but that was the explanation. So air quality, quite a big issue, and it will be if you don't use the windows or some other means of ventilation. Temperature then, here we tried various ways, but in the end we came down to the fact that there should be good temperature controls. The actual person in the specific classroom should be able to control the temperature, whether that's the teacher or the pupils, and if they can, then that would lead to satisfaction. The other thing with temperature was heat gain. Quite a lot of classrooms with big windows facing south and no external shading. Quite a few with external shading, but those that didn't have it, having real problems with heat gain. You know, if the shading's inside, it doesn't help, the heat's in by then, so it's got to be external. So simple stuff, really. Then we get on to individualisation. The first level of this is individualisation in relation to the type of people we've got in these classrooms. And the first thing is to say that breakout spaces were always valuable. We factored them in as being a good thing, and they came out as being a good thing. So this would be an associated space with the classroom where somebody could go and do some independent work, or could be sent if they'd been bad or something like that. But it's an extra facility, an extra space that can be used. Plenty of wall display was also seen as a beneficial thing. This came out for a funny reason, which is that actually if you put a lot of windows in a classroom, if you have a lot of cupboarding in a classroom, you can end up with nowhere to put displays, and it seems the teachers actually do need display space. Then this bit's more complicated. This is floor plan. We struggled with this a lot. We had some very complex floor plans. You can see these are quite complicated classrooms with funny shapes, and for the older children, a simpler space with more floor area ideally. For the younger children, more complicated spaces where they can actually have those zones and they're a real feature within the classroom. The difficulty, of course, is if you want to move people between these classrooms of different ages, it gives you some inflexibility in terms of how you use the school, but this seems to be the ideal in terms of how they learn. The other issue of individualisation was ownership. We actually looked at the displays on the walls and said, does it include work by the pupils? Do they have their name on the drawer, on the desk, on the peg? Is there evidence of them as individuals in that space? Is this classroom just a box, or has it got something distinctive about it? So you'd actually say, yeah, this is my classroom. I recognise it when I come into it. So it's a whole bundle of things that we took into account, and we put those together as an ownership thing. This is a matter of they could relate to that space. They didn't just walk into the space and it was just a box, it was just anonymous. It was actually their space that they had contributed to and that they had recognised as compared with other classrooms. So this is the sort of thing that educationalists would say. We factored it in relation to the physical factors, and it seems to work really quite powerfully. Level of stimulation then, looking at complexity. So this is visual complexity. You can have too little, you can have too much. We said low stimulation to high stimulation to start with. We now say boring to distracting or something like that. You know, we've changed the words. We've changed how we see it, and you need to aim somewhere in the middle along those lines. So that makes sense, I suppose, doesn't it? We're talking about learning. You want to be a bit excited, but you want to be able to concentrate. It's that sort of feel. And in relation to colour, it's the same sort of thing. So last time I was saying white is bad. Well, now white is coming out as not bad, so long as it's complemented by some areas, maybe a feature wall, maybe an alcove, with some brighter colour associated with it. And then you end up saying, OK, these are about right. That's a little bit too plain in terms of colour, and that's a bit too much, where you've got the primary colour on pretty much all of the walls. These are quite hard things to measure. We did this subjectively by two people doing it and comparing what they came up with. We could do that pretty reliably quite quickly, actually. We've also tried a mathematical way of doing this by analysing photographs, and we can sort of almost replicate those results, but it's not quite there yet. So conclusions then. I think what we've done is, I think we've been able to identify the key aspects of building design that impact on learning. It's a perfectly valid point that learning is only one factor. There's health, there's behaviour, there's happiness, there's all sorts of things. This is learning. It's learning in a UK sense. It's smallish children, so whether this would apply in the same way to secondary school children, the older children, I don't think it would. We really wanted to do this study, but we haven't got the funding yet. But we think in secondary schools, they move from class to class. I think the social spaces would be more important. The spaces between the classes would be more important than they are in primary schools, where for a primary school, the class is the child's universe almost. You know, it's where they just live with their teacher. So, you know, it has limitations as well. But it gives you some ideas about things that can be done. This is for designers and for educationalists. Some of these things are really cheap to do. You know, what colour are you going to paint it? How much decoration are you going to put on the wall in terms of displays? They're very easy things, and they're things that teachers can do straight away. So this is one of the things that's come through, which is that it's not a matter of let's knock the school down and start again. Schools can be quite readily adapted to take into account quite a few of these things. And if it is going to cost money, well then maybe it gives some clues as to where that money can best be spent if you're going to orientate schools towards education. Strange idea that, and it is a strange idea because actually the criteria for school design in the UK don't mention education. They don't mention learning. They mention being flexible, they mention being innovative, they mention being open to the community. They actually take education for granted. So I think it's quite a good idea to actually say, well, learning should be centre stage when we're making these decisions, and maybe this helps put it there. Thank you very much.